Hello everyone, tonight I've got 3 special scary stories for all of you. So before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. This happened during the time I encountered the man who knew my name. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. It was the winter of 2024 and I was 21 years old, living in a small suburban town in Ohio. I had recently dropped out of community college and was working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour Walmart to save up some money. The store was located in a sprawling strip mall that felt completely abandoned once the sun went down. My job was in the electronics department, which was usually the quietest part of the store during the night. Most of my shift involved unpacking crates of chargers, locking up expensive cameras, and wandering the aisles to make sure nobody was trying to pocket a pair of headphones. The fluorescent lights overhead always had this low, buzzing hum that seemed to get louder when the store was empty. It was a mind-numbing job, but it paid the bills, and for the most part, I liked being left alone with my thoughts. The winter that year was particularly brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping well below freezing. There had been a string of car break-ins in the strip mall parking lot, so everyone was on edge about the outside threats. The management kept telling us to be careful walking to our cars and to never leave the building alone after 2 a.m., but honestly, I always felt safe once I was inside those sliding glass doors. I figured that as long as I was under the bright lights and the security cameras, nothing bad could really happen to me. It was a Tuesday night, or technically a Wednesday morning. Around 2:15 a.m. the store was deathly quiet, even for a weekday. My only coworker in the area, a guy named Marcus, had gone on his lunch break, leaving me alone at the electronics counter. I was busy scanning some new inventory when I felt that prickly sensation on the back of my neck. It was that specific feeling you get when you know someone is staring at you from a distance. I looked up from my scanner and glanced toward the end of the aisle. Standing near the video game display was a man I hadn't noticed coming into the department. He looked completely ordinary, maybe in his late 40s, wearing a standard gray windbreaker and dark jeans. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, just standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the Nintendo Switch cases. I did the usual retail thing and asked him if he needed help finding anything. The man didn't look at me right away. He kept his eyes fixed on the shelf for a few seconds before slowly turning his head. He had a very neutral, almost blank expression on his face. He didn't look angry or crazy, just empty. He took a few steps toward the counter, and that was when he spoke. He didn't ask about a price or a product. He just looked me dead in the eye and said, "It's good to see you again, Trevor Langley." I froze. My heart did a weird little skip in my chest because I had never seen this man before in my life. I wasn't wearing a name tag that night because I had lost mine a week prior, and even if I had been, our tags only showed our first names. There was absolutely no way this stranger should have known my full name. I tried to play it cool, thinking maybe he was a former teacher or a neighbor I'd forgotten, but nothing about his face rang a bell. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do I know you from somewhere?" The man let out a small, dry chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned against the glass counter, getting uncomfortably close to my personal space. He told me that we had spoken for nearly 20 minutes earlier that night near the seasonal section. He even mentioned specific details, like how I told him I was worried about my car's battery dying in the cold. I felt a wave of cold sweat break out across my forehead. I knew for a fact that I hadn't been to the seasonal section all night, and I definitely hadn't spoken to any customers about my car. I told him he must have me confused with someone else, but he just shook his head slowly. He insisted that we had a great talk and that he was glad I was taking his advice about keeping my front door dead-bolted at night. At this point, I was genuinely starting to panic. The mention of my front door felt like a direct threat, even if he was saying it in a helpful tone. I told him I had to get back to work and started walking toward the back storage room, hoping he would just leave. I didn't look back until I reached the heavy swinging doors. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the aisle was completely empty. The man was gone, and I hadn't heard the sound of his footsteps or the sliding front doors opening. I waited in the back for about 10 minutes until Marcus came back from his break. I was visibly shaking, and Marcus asked me what was wrong. I explained the encounter, telling him about the man who knew my full name and the weird conversation he claimed we had. Marcus looked concerned, but also a bit skeptical. He suggested that maybe the guy was just a creep who had followed me on social media or something. We decided to go talk to the overnight manager, Rick, and check the security footage. Rick was a no-nonsense guy who had worked security for years before moving into management. He took me seriously when I mentioned the guy knew my full name and my home details. We went into the small, cramped security office and started rewinding the tapes. We pulled up the feed for the electronics department starting at 2:10 a.m. I watched the screen intensely, waiting to see the man in the gray windbreaker walk into the frame. We watched the footage for 10 minutes. On the screen, I saw myself standing at the counter, scanning the inventory just like I remembered. But then at 2:15 a.m., things got weird. On the video, I suddenly stopped scanning and looked up toward the end of the aisle. I started talking, gesturing with my hands and moving my lips as if I were having a conversation with someone, but there was nobody there. The aisle was completely empty. In the footage, I was leaning over the counter, looking directly at a spot where a person should have been standing, but the camera showed nothing but the tiled floor and the display racks. I watched myself laugh nervously at a joke I didn't remember hearing. I watched myself listen intently to a person who didn't exist. It looked like I was having a full-blown psychotic break, talking to thin air for 5 straight minutes. Rick and Marcus were dead silent. I felt like I was going to throw up. I begged Rick to check the footage from the seasonal section earlier in the night where the man claimed we had first spoken. We went back to 12:45 a.m. and found the footage of the seasonal department. Sure enough, the camera showed me standing near the artificial Christmas trees, talking to the air once again. I was nodding and smiling, clearly engaged with a phantom. I told Rick I couldn't finish my shift. I felt like I was losing my mind, or worse, that something was following me that the cameras couldn't see. Rick didn't even argue, he just told me to go home and get some rest. He offered to walk me to my car, and I gladly accepted. The walk across the frozen parking lot felt like it took hours. Every shadow between the cars looked like a man in a gray windbreaker, waiting to call my name again. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified that I would see a passenger sitting in my backseat who wasn't on the camera. I lived in a small, one-bedroom house about 10 minutes away from the strip mall. It was an old place with creaky floors and thin walls, but I had always felt safe there until that night. As I pulled into my driveway, I remembered the man's words about the deadbolt. I ran from my car to the front porch, fumbling with my keys in the freezing wind. When I finally got inside, I slammed the door and threw the deadbolt immediately. I turned on every single light in the house, from the kitchen to the bathroom. I sat on my couch with a kitchen knife on the coffee table, staring at the front door. I stayed like that for hours, listening to the house settle and the wind howl against the siding. Eventually, the sun started to come up and I began to feel a little foolish. I figured I must have been extremely sleep-deprived. Maybe I had experienced some kind of vivid hallucination brought on by the stress of the night shift and the repetitive nature of the job. I tried to convince myself that the reason the man wasn't on the camera was that he wasn't real. It was a terrifying thought, but somehow less scary than the alternative. I decided to try and get some sleep. I walked into my bedroom and started to pull the curtains shut to block out the morning light. That was when I noticed something on my nightstand. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper that hadn't been there when I left for work at 10 p.m. My heart began to pound against my ribs as I reached out and picked it up. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely unfold it. Inside the paper, written in neat, cramped handwriting, were the words, "You forgot to lock the back window, Trevor. I told you to be careful." I dropped the note and sprinted to the kitchen, where the small window above the sink was located. I had left it cracked an inch to let out some steam from cooking dinner the night before. Now it was pushed all the way up, and the screen had been neatly sliced open from the outside. I called the police immediately. They came out and took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no fingerprints on the window or the note, and no signs of a struggle or anything stolen. They told me to change my locks and maybe invest in a security system. I moved out of that house a week later and moved back in with my parents. I never went back to that Walmart, and I haven't worked a night shift since. To this day, I still don't know who that man was or how he knew my name. I don't know if he was a person who knew how to hide from cameras or if he was something else entirely. But the thing that keeps me up at night isn't the thought of him being in the store. It's the realization that while I was talking to nothing under the bright lights of the electronics department, he was already miles away, sitting inside my house and waiting for me to come home. I sometimes wonder if he's still watching me from a distance, waiting for me to forget a lock or leave a window cracked. Every time I hear my name called in a crowded place, I freeze and look for a gray windbreaker. I've become obsessed with home security, checking my doors and windows multiple times every night before I can even think about sleeping. The silence of my new apartment is peaceful most of the time, but occasionally I'll hear a faint rustle or a floorboard creak that sounds just a little too deliberate. I try to tell myself it's just the building settling, but deep down, I'm always listening for a voice that knows exactly who I am. Story 2. It was the first winter I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I had just moved to a small town in northern Pennsylvania for a fresh start after a messy breakup, taking a job at a local Walmart to keep myself busy. The town was the kind of place where everything shut down by 9 p.m., leaving the streets empty and the air heavy with a quiet that I wasn't used to. I lived in a tiny, drafty apartment about 15 minutes away from the store, and since I didn't know anyone yet, my life revolved almost entirely around my shifts. The winter that year was particularly brutal, with lake-effect snow piling up several feet high and temperatures constantly dropping into the negatives. Working the late-night closing shift meant I was often leaving the store well after midnight, when the world felt completely deserted. The Walmart sat on the edge of town, surrounded by a massive expanse of asphalt that seemed to stretch on forever in the dark. By the time my shift ended, the vast parking lot was usually a ghost town, with only a few patches of ice reflecting the orange glow of the flickering streetlights. On this specific night, I was scheduled to work until 12:30 a.m., but we had a big shipment coming in, so my manager asked if I could stay late to help organize the back room. I didn't have anything else to do, so I agreed. Finally punching out at 1:48 a.m., the store was eerily quiet as I walked toward the front entrance, my footsteps echoing against the linoleum floors. Most of the overhead lights had been dimmed to their night setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty aisles of the grocery section. I remember stopping at the glass doors for a second, pulling my heavy coat tighter and wrapping my scarf around my face. The wind was howling outside, rattling the shopping carts that were lined up in the outdoor vestibule. I checked my phone and saw that the temperature had dropped to -4 degrees. I dreaded the walk to my car, which I had parked way out toward the back of the lot near a light pole that was currently burnt out. I usually parked closer, but the lot had been packed when I arrived for my shift at 4 p.m. As I pushed through the sliding doors, the freezing air hit me like a physical wall, stinging my eyes and making my lungs ache. I started walking quickly, my boots crunching on the fresh layer of snow that had fallen over the ice. The parking lot was almost entirely empty now, save for a few employee cars scattered near the entrance. I could see my old silver sedan sitting lonely under the dark light pole about 100 yards away. It looked like a small, frozen island in a sea of dark pavement. About halfway to my car, I noticed something that made me slow my pace just a little bit. There was another vehicle parked about 3 rows over from mine, tucked into the shadows where the light didn't reach. It was a dark, older model SUV, and it was just sitting there, completely still. What caught my attention was that its headlights were turned off, but I could see a faint plume of exhaust rising from the tailpipe into the freezing night air. It was idling, which was strange for a car sitting in an empty lot at nearly 2 in the morning. I tried to tell myself it was probably just another employee warming up their car before heading home, but a knot of unease started to form in my stomach. I kept walking, keeping my head down and focusing on the sound of my own breathing. As I got closer to my row, I glanced over at the SUV again. The windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see if anyone was sitting inside, but the vehicle remained perfectly still, the engine humming a low, steady rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my boots. I reached into my pocket and gripped my keys, pressing the unlock button as I got within 20 feet of my car. The familiar chirp of the alarm and the flash of my hazard lights felt incredibly comforting in the oppressive darkness. I picked up my pace, almost jogging now, wanting nothing more than to be inside with the doors locked. But just as I reached for the driver's side door handle, I heard a sound that made my heart stop dead in my chest. It was the distinct, mechanical whir of my car's engine turning over. I froze, my hand hovering inches from the handle. I hadn't used a remote starter. My car was a 2012 model that didn't even have that feature. Yet I could feel the hood vibrating, and the muffled roar of the engine filled the silence of the lot. For a split second, I thought maybe I had somehow left it running when I went into work, but I knew that was impossible. I always made a point to double-check my locks, and I had my keys right there in my hand. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the freezing wind whipping around me, staring at my own car as if it were a predator. That's when I noticed something through the frost-covered rear window. There was a dark shape positioned right in the center of the back seat. At first, I thought it was just a pile of laundry or a coat I had left behind, but then the shape moved. It shifted slightly to the left, and I saw the distinct outline of a human head and shoulders silhouetted against the faint light of the distant street lamp. My blood turned to ice and a surge of pure primal adrenaline flooded my system. Someone was sitting in the back seat of my car, and they had somehow started the engine from the inside. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and bolted back toward the Walmart entrance as fast as my legs could carry me, my boots slipping and sliding on the patches of black ice. I didn't look back, but I could hear the roar of an engine behind me, not my car's engine, but the deep, heavy rumble of the dark SUV I had seen earlier. Reached the sliding doors and slammed my weight against them, forgetting for a moment that they were automatic. They took an agonizingly long 3 seconds to slide open, and I dove inside, screaming for help. 2 of the overnight stalkers, a guy named Mike and an older woman named Sarah, came running from the nearby aisles. I was hyperventilating, pointing back toward the parking lot, unable to get the words out. Mike grabbed his radio and called for the manager while Sarah guided me toward the service desk. "Someone is in my car," I finally managed to gasp out, my voice shaking so hard it was barely audible. "Someone is in my car and they're following me." Mike looked through the glass doors just in time to see the dark SUV peel out of the parking lot, its tires screeching against the frozen asphalt as it sped toward the main road. My silver sedan, however, was still sitting under the dark light pole, its engine idling and its headlights now shining brightly, cutting through the darkness like two accusing eyes. The manager, a stern man named Robert, arrived a minute later and immediately called the police. While we waited for them to arrive, he let me sit in the manager's office, giving me a cup of lukewarm coffee that I was too shaky to even hold. We watched the security footage on the small monitors in the office. Because of where I had parked, the camera angle was distant and grainy, but we could see the events unfold. At around 1:12 a.m., a figure had emerged from the dark SUV and approached my car. They seemed to have some kind of tool because they got the door open in seconds without setting off the alarm. The figure climbed into the back seat and stayed there, completely motionless, for over 30 minutes. They were waiting for me. On the screen, I watched myself walk out of the store and head toward the car. The moment I hit the unlock button on my key fob, the person in the back seat reached forward, somehow manipulated the ignition, and started the car. It was a calculated move, designed to lure me in or perhaps just to terrify me. The police arrived at 2:15 a.m. Two officers took my statement while a third went out to inspect my car. I stayed inside the store, watching through the window as they approached my vehicle with their flashlights drawn. They spent a long time looking through the windows before finally opening the doors. I saw them pull something out of the back seat, something small that they placed into a plastic evidence bag. My heart was pounding against my ribs as I waited for them to come back inside and tell me what they found. When the lead officer returned, his expression was grim. He explained that whoever had been in my car was gone by the time I ran back to the store, likely slipping out the passenger side while I was distracted by the SUV. But they had left something behind on the floor of the back seat. He held up the evidence bag and I felt a wave of nausea hit me. Inside was a small, handheld glass cutter, a pair of heavy-duty zip ties, and a single Polaroid photo. The officer hesitated before showing me the photo. When he did, I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. It was a picture taken from outside my apartment window. It showed me sitting on my couch, looking at my laptop, completely unaware that someone was standing in the snow just a few feet away. The timestamp on the bottom of the photo was from 3 nights prior. This person hadn't just found me at Walmart. They had been following me, learning my routine, and watching me in the place where I was supposed to be the safest. The police searched the area for the dark SUV, but they never found it. The plates on the security footage were too blurry to read, and the vehicle was a common model that could have been anyone's. They escorted me back to my apartment that night and did a full sweep of the place, but everything seemed untouched. Still, I couldn't stay there. I packed a bag and drove 3 hours to my parents' house as soon as the sun came up, leaving the job in that town behind forever. I sold the car a week later. I couldn't stand the thought of sitting in that driver's seat, knowing that someone had been crouched directly behind me, waiting for the right moment to reach out. To this day, the police haven't made any arrests, and the identity of the person in the back seat remains a mystery. I moved to a different state and took a job with a normal 9-to-5 schedule, but I still can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'm in a parking lot after dark. Sometimes, when I'm walking to my new car in the evening, I'll catch the scent of cold exhaust or hear the distant rumble of an idling engine, and I'll feel that same paralyzing chill all over again. I often think back to that night and wonder what would have happened if I hadn't hesitated when I heard the engine start. If I had just opened the door and sat down, I would have been inches away from a person who had been planning for days to take me. The scariest part isn't even the photo or the zip ties they found. It's the fact that when the police inspected the ignition of my car, they found that it hadn't been hot-wired or forced. The person in the back seat had been using a spare key, a key that I had lost 3 weeks earlier and assumed I'd just dropped in the snow. They didn't just find me. They had been waiting for the perfect moment to use the access I didn't even know I'd given them. Story 3. Back in the fall of 2019, I worked the customer service desk at a local Walmart. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. At the time, I was 22 years old and working the closing shift to help pay for my classes at the community college nearby. The store I worked at was located in a suburban part of Pennsylvania, right on the edge of a very wooded area. It wasn't exactly a high-crime neighborhood, but the night shift always brought out the strange people. Customer service at a big box store is usually just a cycle of boredom and frustration. Most nights, I deal with people trying to return used electronics or complaining about a price match that didn't go their way. By 11 p.m., the store would get incredibly quiet. The bright fluorescent lights would hum in a way that felt like they were vibrating inside your head. It was just me, a few shelf stockers in the distant aisles, and the occasional late-night shopper wandering around like a ghost. On this particular Tuesday night, the store felt even more deserted than usual. A heavy rainstorm had been moving through the area, and the sound of the water hitting the flat roof of the building was a constant, low roar. My shift was supposed to end at midnight, and I was already starting to pack up my small station. I was counting down the minutes, staring at the digital clock on the register that read 11:38 p.m. That was when I saw her walking toward the desk from the main entrance. She was a tall woman, probably in her late 40s, wearing a yellow raincoat that was dripping wet. She wasn't running or looking rushed. She was walking with a very slow, deliberate pace. What stood out to me first was that she wasn't using a shopping cart or a basket. Instead, she was dragging a large, black, heavy-duty trash bag across the floor. The sound of the plastic sliding against the polished tile was loud in the empty store. It was a rhythmic, scratching sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. As she got closer, I noticed she was leaving a trail behind her. It wasn't just rainwater from her coat. There was a dark, thick liquid leaking from the bottom of the trash bag. It left a smeared, brownish-red streak on the white floor that looked like it was coming from something heavy inside the bag. I tried to stay professional and told myself it was probably just leaked transmission fluid or maybe some spoiled groceries she was trying to get a refund for. She stopped at the counter and didn't say a word at first. She just stood there staring at me with these very wide, unblinking eyes. Her face was incredibly pale, almost the color of paper, and her hair was matted to her forehead from the rain. She heaved the bag up onto the counter with a loud thud. The smell hit me almost immediately. It was a metallic, sweet scent mixed with something like rotting vinegar. It was so strong that I had to take a step back and cover my nose with the collar of my vest. "I need to return this," she said. Her voice was flat and monotone, like she was reading from a script. She didn't look angry or upset, she just looked completely empty. I looked down at the bag, which was now pooling that dark liquid onto the laminate counter. I told her that I couldn't accept a return in a trash bag and that I needed to see what was inside. I also mentioned that she would need a receipt for any kind of cash refund. Without saying anything, she reached into the pocket of her raincoat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the counter with her wet hand and pushed it toward me. I picked it up, trying not to get the moisture on my hands. It was a standard Walmart receipt, but as soon as I looked at the date, my heart skipped a beat. The date printed at the top of the receipt was for the following day. It was dated for Wednesday, October 16th, 2019. I looked at the clock on my register again. It was only 11:43 p.m. on Tuesday the 15th. I figured it was just a glitch in our system, or maybe the registers at another store were set to the wrong time zone. I told her that the date looked a bit weird, but she didn't react. She just kept staring at me, waiting for me to open the bag. I felt a knot of pure dread forming in my stomach, but I had to follow protocol. I reached for the top of the bag where it was knotted shut. The plastic was slippery and cold. As I started to untie the knot, the smell became even more overpowering. It was the kind of smell that stays in the back of your throat for days. I finally got the bag open and pulled the plastic apart to see what was inside. I expected to see a broken appliance or maybe some ruined clothes. Instead, the first thing I saw was a pair of high-end hiking boots. They were covered in thick, wet mud and what looked like dark red stains. I reached in further, moving a layer of what felt like heavy, wet denim. My hand brushed against something cold and hard. I pulled it out slightly to get a better look under the bright lights of the service desk. It was a heavy tactical flashlight, the kind police officers use. The lens was shattered and there was hair caught in the jagged glass. Real, human hair. At that moment, I realized I wasn't looking at a return. I was looking at a collection of items that looked like they had been taken directly from a crime scene. I looked up at the woman, and for the first time, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a wide, jagged expression that didn't reach her eyes. "You won't be needing those anymore," she whispered. I felt a wave of cold air hit me, even though the store was warm. I told her I had to go get my manager to authorize the return, which was a lie. I just needed to get away from her and get to a phone. I backed away from the counter, keeping my eyes on her the whole time. I walked quickly toward the back office where the night manager, a guy named Dave, was usually doing paperwork. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the door handle. I burst into the office and told Dave he needed to come to the front right now and call the police. He looked at me like I was crazy until he saw the look on my face. We both ran back toward the customer service desk, but when we got there, the woman was gone. The trash bag was still sitting on the counter, leaking that dark fluid onto the floor, but the woman had vanished into the aisles. Dave immediately picked up the store phone and dialed 911. While he was talking to the dispatcher, I walked around the counter to see if she was hiding nearby. The store felt dead silent again except for the rain. I looked toward the front doors and saw that they were still closed. There was no way she could have left without the sensors picking her up. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. 2 officers came in looking annoyed to be out in the rain, but their expressions changed as soon as they saw the bag. They put on gloves and started pulling things out one by one. Beside the boots and the broken flashlight, they found a wallet, a set of keys, and a blood-stained windbreaker. The wallet belonged to a man named Mark Stevens. He was a local park ranger who had been reported missing 2 days earlier from the woods just a few miles away. The officers were confused about the receipt I had shown them. When they looked at it, they noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the very bottom, in the section where the total amount is usually listed, there was no price. Instead, it just said paid in full. The time of the transaction on the receipt was listed as 2:15 a.m. Like I said, it was currently only about 12:30 a.m. on the night this was happening. The receipt was essentially a log of an event that hadn't even happened, yet according to the clock. The police searched the entire store, from the garden center to the back warehouse. They checked the bathrooms, the break room, and even the roof. They found absolutely no sign of the woman in the yellow raincoat. When they checked the security footage, things got even weirder. The cameras showed me standing at the counter, talking to nobody. In the video, the trash bag appears to just be sitting on the counter the whole time, but there is no woman visible. It looks like I'm talking to thin air. The most disturbing part of the footage was the bag itself. In the video, you can see the bag being lifted onto the counter by an invisible force. You can see the plastic indenting as if hands are gripping it, but there is no person there. The police didn't know what to make of it. They took the bag and the items as evidence, and they spent the rest of the night taking my statement. I was sent home early, but I didn't sleep a single wink that night. The next day, Wednesday the 16th, the news reported that the body of Mark Stevens had been found in the woods. According to the coroner's report, he had been killed with a blunt object, likely a heavy flashlight. But the detail that chilled me to the bone was the time of death. They estimated he had been killed sometime between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. on Wednesday morning. That was exactly the window of time printed on the receipt the woman had given me. If the receipt was right, that meant the murder hadn't even happened when she walked into the store. She was trying to return items that hadn't been stolen yet from a man who was still alive at the time she stood in front of me. I quit my job at Walmart the very next week. I couldn't stand being in that building anymore, especially at night. Every time I heard the sound of plastic sliding on the floor, I would start to panic. The woman was never found, and the police eventually stopped calling me for updates. They ruled the security footage corrupted, even though I knew what I saw. To this day, I still think about that receipt. Sometimes I wonder if she's still out there, visiting other stores and leaving behind proof of things that haven't happened yet. But what scares me the most isn't the woman or the blood. It's the thought that somewhere in a database I can't see, there might be a receipt with my name on it, dated for tomorrow.